Chapter 53 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 53. The Friend is Found. Mrs. Ellmother looked into the parlour. "I told you Mr. Mirabel would call again," she announced. "Here he is." "Has he asked to see me?" "He leaves it entirely to you." For a moment, and a moment only, Emily was undecided. "Show him in," she said. Mirabel's embarrassment was visible the moment he entered the room. For the first time in his life, in the presence of a woman, the popular preacher was shy. He who had taken hundreds of fair hands with sympathetic pressure, he who had offered fluent consolation abroad and at home to beauty in distress, was conscious of a rising colour, and was absolutely at a loss for words when Emily received him. And yet, though he appeared at disadvantage, and worse still, though he was aware of it himself, there was nothing contemptible in his look and manner. His silence and confusion revealed a change in him which inspired respect. Love had developed this spoiled darling of foolish congregations, this effeminate pet of drawing-rooms and boudoirs, into the likeness of a man, and no woman in Emily's position could have failed to see that it was love which she herself had inspired. Equally ill at ease, they both took refuge in the commonplace phrases suggested by the occasion. These exhausted, there was a pause. Mirabel alluded to Cecilia as a means of continuing the conversation. "Have you seen Miss Wyvil?" he inquired. "She was here last night, and I expect to see her again to-day before she returns to Monksmoor with her father. Do you go back with them?" "Yes, if you do." "I remain in London." "Then I remain in London too." The strong feeling that was in him forced its way to expression at last. In happier days, when she had persistently refused to let him talk seriously, she would have been ready with a light-hearted reply. She was silent now. Mirabel pleaded with her not to misunderstand him by an honest confession of his motives, which presented him under a new aspect. The easy, plausible man, who had hardly ever seemed to be in earnest before, seriously meant what he said now. "May I try to explain myself?" he asked. "Certainly, if you wish it." "Pray don't suppose me capable," Mirabel said earnestly, "of presuming to pay you an idle compliment. I cannot think of you alone and in trouble without feeling anxiety which can only be relieved in one way. I must be near enough to hear of you day by day, not by repeating this visit. Unless you wish it, I will not again cross the threshold of your door. Mrs. Ellmother will tell me if your mind is more at ease. Mrs. Ellmother will tell me if there is any new trial of your fortitude. She needn't even mention that I have been speaking to her at the door, and she may be sure, and you may be sure, that I shall ask no inquisitive questions. I can feel for you in your misfortune without wishing to know what that misfortune is. If I can ever be of the smallest use, think of me as your other servant. Say to Mrs. Ellmother, 'I want him,' and say no more." Where is the woman who could have resisted such devotion as this, inspired, truly inspired by herself? Emily's eyes softened as she answered him. "You little know how your kindness touches me," she said. "Don't speak of my kindness until you have put me to the proof," he interposed. "Can a friend, such a friend as I am, be of any use?" "Of the greatest use, if I could feel justified in trying you." "I entreat you to try me." "But, Mr. Mirabel, you don't know what I am thinking of."
"I don't want to know."
"I may be wrong. My friends all say I am wrong."
"I don't care what your friends say. I don't care about any earthly thing but your tranquillity. Does your dog ask whether you are right or wrong? I am your dog. I think of you, and I think of nothing else."
She looked back through the experience of the past few days. Miss Ladd, Mrs. Ellmother, Dr. Alday, not one of them had felt for her. Not one of them had spoken to her as this man had felt and had spoken. She remembered the dreadful sense of solitude and hopelessness which had wrung her heart in the interval before Mirabel came in. Her father himself could hardly have been kinder to her than this friend of a few weeks only. She looked at him through her tears. She could say nothing that was equivalent, nothing even that was adequate. "You are very good to me," was her only acknowledgment of all that he had offered. How poor it seemed to be, and yet how much it meant. He rose, saying considerately that he would leave her to recover herself, and would wait to hear if he was wanted. "No," she said, "I must not let you go in common gratitude. I ought to decide before you leave me, and I do decide to take you into my confidence." She hesitated. Her colour rose a little. "I know how unselfishly you offered me your help," she resumed. "I know you speak to me as a brother might speak to a sister." He gently interrupted her. "No," he said, "I can't honestly claim to do that. And may I venture to remind you, you know why—" She started. Her eyes rested on him with a momentary expression of reproach. "Is it quite fair," she asked, "in my situation to say that?"
"Would it be quite fair," he rejoined, "to allow you to deceive yourself? Should I deserve to be taken into your confidence if I encouraged you to trust me under false pretenses? Not a word more of those hopes on which the happiness of my life depends shall pass my lips, unless you permit it. In my devotion to your interests, I promise to forget myself. My motives may be misinterpreted. My position may be misunderstood. Ignorant people may take me for that other happier man, who is an object of interest to you."
"Stop, Mr. Mirabel. The person to whom you refer has no such claim on me as you suppose."
"Dare I say how happy I am to hear it?
Will you forgive me?" "I will forgive you, if you say no more."
Their eyes met. Completely overcome by the new happiness that she had inspired, Mirabel was unable to answer her. His sensitive nerves trembled under emotion, like the nerves of a woman. His delicate complexion faded away slowly into whiteness. Emily was alarmed. He seemed to be on the point of fainting. She ran to the window to open it more widely. "Pray don't trouble yourself," he said. "I am easily agitated by any sudden sensation, and I am a little overcome at this moment by my own happiness."
"Let me give you a glass of wine."
"Thank you. I don't need it, indeed."
"You really feel better?"
"I feel quite well again, and eager to hear how I can serve you."
"It's a long story, Mr. Mirabel, and a dreadful story."
"Dreadful?"
"Yes. Let me tell you first how you can serve me. I am in search of a man who has done me the cruelest wrong that one human creature can inflict on another. But the chances are all against me. I'm only a woman, and I don't know how to take even the first step towards discovery."
"You will know when I guide you." He reminded her tenderly of what she might expect of him, and was rewarded by a grateful look. Seeing nothing, suspecting nothing, they advanced together nearer and nearer to the end. "Once or twice," Emily continued, "I spoke to you of my poor father when we were at Monksmoor, and I must speak of him again. You could have no interest in inquiring about a stranger, and you cannot have heard how he died." "Pardon me, I heard from Mr. Wyvil how he died." "You heard what I had told Mr. Wyvil," Emily said. "I was wrong." "Wrong?" Mirabel exclaimed, in a tone of courteous surprise. "Was it not a sudden death?" "It was a sudden death." "Caused by disease of the heart?" "Caused by no disease. I have been deceived about my father's death, and I have only discovered it a few days since." At the impending moment of the frightful shock which she was innocently about to inflict on him, she stopped, doubtful whether it would be best to relate how the discovery had been made, or to pass at once to the result. Mirabel supposed that she had paused to control her agitation. He was so immeasurably far away from the faintest suspicion of what was coming, that he exerted his ingenuity in the hope of sparing her. "I can anticipate the rest," he said. "Your sad loss has been caused by some fatal accident. Let us change the subject. Tell me more of that man whom I must help you to find. It will only distress you to dwell on your father's death." "Distress me?" she repeated. "His death maddens me." "Oh, don't say that." Hear me. My father died, murdered, at Zealand, and that man you must help me to find is the wretch who killed him." She started to her feet with a cry of terror. Mirabel dropped from his chair, senseless, to the floor. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 54. The End of the Fainting Fit. Emily recovered her presence of mind. She opened the door so as to make a draught of air in the room, and called for water. Returning to Mirabel, she loosened his cravat. Mrs. Ellmother came in just in time to prevent her from committing a common error in the treatment of fainting persons, by raising Mirabel's head. The current of air and the sprinkling of water over his face soon produced their customary effect. "He'll come round directly," Mrs. Ellmother remarked. "Your aunt was sometimes taken by these swoons, miss, and I know something about them. He looks a poor weak creature in spite of his big beard. Has anything frightened him?" Emily little knew how correctly that chance guess had hit on the truth. "Nothing can possibly have frightened him," she replied. "I am afraid he is in bad health. He turned suddenly pale while we were talking, and I thought he was going to be taken ill. He made light of it, and seemed to recover. Unfortunately, I was right. It was the threatening of a fainting fit. He dropped to the floor a minute afterward." A sigh fluttered over Mirabel's lips. His eyes opened, looked at Mrs. Ellmother in vacant terror, and closed again. Emily whispered to her to leave the room. The old woman smiled satirically as she opened the door, then looked back with a sudden change of humour. To see the kind young mistress bending over the feeble little clergyman set her, by some strange association of ideas, thinking of Alban Morris. "Ah," she muttered to herself on her way out, "I call him a man." There was wine in the sideboard, the wine which Emily had once already offered in vain. Mirabel drank it eagerly this time. He looked round the room as if he wished to be sure that they were alone. "Have I fallen to a low place in your estimation?" he asked, smiling faintly. "I am afraid you will think poorly enough of your new ally after this." "I only think you should take more care of your health. Emily replied, with sincere interest in his recovery. "Let me leave you to rest on the sofa." He refused to remain at the cottage. He asked, with a sudden change to fretfulness, if she would let her servant get him a cab. She ventured to doubt whether he was quite strong enough yet to go away by himself. He piteously reiterated his request. A passing cab was stopped directly. Emily accompanied him to the gate. "I know what to do," he said in a hurried, absent way. "Rest and a little tonic medicine will soon set me right." The clammy coldness of his skin made Emily shudder as they shook hands. "You won't think the worse of me for this?" he asked. "How can you imagine such a thing?" Emily answered warmly. "Will you see me if I come tomorrow?" "I shall be anxious to see you." So they parted. Emily returned to the house, pitying him with all her heart. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Book the 6th. Here and There. Chapter 55. Mirabel Sees His Way. Reaching the hotel at which he was accustomed to stay when he was in London, Mirabel locked the door of his room. He looked at the houses on the opposite side of the street. His mind was in such a state of distrust that he lowered the blind over the window. In solitude and obscurity, the miserable wretch sat down in a corner and covered his face with his hands, and tried to realize what had happened to him. Nothing had been said at the fatal interview with Emily which could have given him the slightest warning of what was to come. Her father's name, absolutely unknown to him when he fled from the inn, had only been communicated to the public by the newspaper reports of the adjourned inquest. At the time when those reports appeared, he was in hiding, under circumstances which prevented him from seeing a newspaper. While the murder was still a subject of conversation, he was in France, far out of the trace of English travellers, and he remained on the continent until the summer of 1881. No exercise of discretion on his part could have extracted him from the terrible position in which he was now placed. He stood pledged to Emily to discover the man suspected of the murder of her father, and that man was himself. What refuge was left open to him? If he took to flight, his sudden disappearance would be a suspicious circumstance in itself, and would therefore provoke inquiries which might lead to serious results. Supposing that he overlooked the risk thus presented, would he be capable of enduring a separation from Emily, which might be a separation for life? Even in the first horror of discovering his situation, her influence remained unshaken, the animating spirit of the one manly capacity for resisting which raised him above his own fears. The only prospect before him which he felt himself to be incapable of contemplating was the prospect of leaving Emily. Having arrived at this conclusion, his fears urged him to think of providing for his own safety. The first precaution to adopt was to separate Emily from friends whose advice might be hostile to his interests, perhaps even subversive of his security. To effect this design, he had need of an ally whom he could trust. That ally was at his disposal, far away in the north. At the time when Francine's jealousy began to interfere with all freedom of intercourse between Emily and himself at Monksmoor, he had contemplated making arrangements which might enable them to meet at the house of his invalid sister, Mrs. Delvin. He had spoken of her, and of the bodily affliction which confined her to her room, in terms which had already interested Emily. In the present emergency, he decided on returning to the subject, and on hastening the meeting between the two women, which he had first suggested at Mr. Wyvil's country seat. No time was to be lost in carrying out this intention. He wrote to Mrs. Delvin by that day's post, confiding to her in the first place the critical position in which he now found himself. This done, he proceeded as follows. To your sound judgment, dearest Agatha, it may appear that I am making myself needlessly uneasy about the future. 2 persons only know that I am the man who escaped the inn at Zealand. You are one of them, and Miss Jethro is the other. On you I can absolutely rely, and after my experience of her, I ought to feel sure of Miss Jethro. I admit this, but I cannot get over my distrust of Emily's friends. I fear the cunning old doctor. I doubt Mr. Wyvil. I hate Alban Morris. Do me a favour, my dear. Invite Emily to be your guest, and so separate her from these friends. The old servant who attends on her will be included in the invitation, of course. Mrs. Ellmother is, as I believe, devoted to the interests of Mr. Alban Morris. She will be well out of the way of doing mischief, while we have her safe in your northern solitude. There is no fear that Emily will refuse your invitation. In the first place, she is already interested in you. In the second place, I shall consider the small proprieties of social life, and, instead of travelling with her to your house, I shall follow by a later train. In the third place, I am now the chosen adviser in whom she trusts, and whatever I tell her to do, she will do. It pains me, really and truly pains me, to be compelled to deceive her, but the other alternative is to reveal myself as the wretch of whom she is in search. Was there ever such a situation? And, oh, Agatha, I'm so fond of her. If I fail to persuade her to be my wife, I don't care what becomes of me. I used to think disgrace and death on the scaffold the most frightful prospect that a man can contemplate. In my present frame of mind, a life without Emily may just as well end in that way as in any other. When we are together in your old sea-beaten tower, do your best, my dear, to incline the heart of this sweet girl toward me. If she remains in London, how do I know that Mr. Morris may not recover the place he has lost in her good opinion? The bare idea of it turns me cold. There is one more point on which I must touch before I can finish my letter. When you last wrote, you told me that Sir Jervis Redwood was not expected to live much longer, and that the establishment would be broken up after his death. Can you find out for me what will become, under the circumstances, of Mr. and Mrs. Rook? So far as I am concerned, I don't doubt that the alteration in my personal appearance, which has protected me for years past, may be trusted to preserve me from recognition by these two people. But it is of the utmost importance, remembering the project to which Emily has devoted herself, that she should not meet with Mrs. Rook. They have been already in correspondence, and Mrs. Rook has expressed an intention, if the opportunity offers itself, of calling at the cottage. Another reason, and a pressing reason, for removing Emily from London. We can easily keep the Rooks out of your house, but I own I should feel more at my ease if I heard that they had left Northumberland. With that confession, Mrs. Delvin's brother closed his letter. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 56. Alban Sees His Way. During the first days of Mirabel's sojourn at his hotel in London, events were in progress at Netherwoods, affecting the interests of the man who was the especial object of his distrust. Not long after Miss Ladd had returned to her school, she heard of an artist who was capable of filling the place to be vacated by Alban Morris. It was then the 23rd day of the month. In 4 days more, the new master would be ready to enter on his duties, and Alban would be at liberty. On the 24th day, Alban received a telegram which startled him. The person sending the message was Mrs. Ellmother, and the words were, "Meet me at your railway station at 2 o'clock." He found the old woman in the waiting-room, and he met with a rough reception. "Minutes are precious, Mr. Morris," she said. "You were 2 minutes late. The next train to London stops here in half an hour, and I must go back by it." "Good heavens! What brings you here? Is Emily... Emily is well enough in health, if that's what you mean. As to why I come here, the reason is that it's a deal easier for me, worse luck, to take this journey than to write a letter. One good turn deserves another. I don't forget how kind you were to me away there in the school, and I can't and won't see what's going on at the cottage behind your back, without letting you know of it. Oh, you needn't be alarmed about her. I've made an excuse to get away for a few hours. But I haven't left her by herself. Miss Wyvil has come to London again, and Mr. Mirabel spends the best part of his day with her. Excuse me for a moment, will you? I'm so thirsty after the journey that I can hardly speak." She presented herself at the counter in the waiting-room. "I'll trouble you, young woman, for a glass of ale." She returned to Alban in a better humour. "It's not bad stuff, that. When I have said my say, I'll have a drop more, just to wash the taste of Mirabel out of my mouth. Wait a bit, I have something to ask you. How much longer are you obliged to stop here, teaching the girls to draw?" "I leave Netherwoods in 3 days more," Alban replied. "That's all right. You may be in time to bring Miss Emily to her senses yet." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you don't stop it, she'll marry the parson." "I can't believe it, Mrs. Ellmother. I won't believe it." "Ah, it's a comfort to him, poor fellow, to say that. Look here, Mr. Morris. This is how it stands. You're in disgrace with Miss Emily, and he profits by it. I was fool enough to take a liking to Mr. Mirabel when I first opened the door to him. I know better now. He got on the blind side of me, and now he has got on the blind side of her. Shall I tell you how? By doing what you would have done if you had had the chance. He's helping her, or pretending to help her, I don't know which, to find the man who murdered poor Mr. Brown. After 4 years, and when all the police in England, with a reward to encourage them, did their best, and it came to nothing. Never mind that," Alban said impatiently. "I want to know how Mr. Mirabel is helping her." "That's more than I can tell you. You don't suppose they take me into their confidence? All I can do is to pick up a word here and there, when fine weather tempts them out into the garden. She tells him to suspect Mrs. Rook, and to make inquiries after Miss Jethro. And he has his plans, and he writes them down, which is dead against his doing anything useful, in my opinion. I don't hold with your scribblers. At the same time, I wouldn't count too positively, in your place, on his being likely to fail. That little Mirabel, if it wasn't for his beard, I should believe he was a woman, and a sickly woman too. He fainted in our house the other day. That little Mirabel is in earnest. Rather than leave Miss Emily from Saturday to Monday, he has got a parson out of employment to do his Sunday work for him. And, what's more, he has persuaded her, for some reasons of his own, to leave London next week." "Is she going back to Monksmoor?" "Not she. Mr. Mirabel has got a sister, a widow lady. She's a cripple or something of the sort. Her name is Mrs. Delvin. She lives far away in the North Country, by the sea, and Miss Emily is going to stay with her." "Are you sure of that?" "Sure? I've seen the letter." "Do you mean the invitation?" "Yes, I do. Miss Emily herself showed it to me. I'm to go with her, in attendance on my mistress, as the lady puts it. This I will say for Mrs. Delvin, her handwriting is a credit to the school that taught her, and the poor bedridden creature words her invitations so nicely that I myself couldn't resist it, and I'm a hard one, as you know. You don't seem to heed me, Mr. Morris." "I beg your pardon, I was thinking." "Thinking of what, if I may be so bold?"
"Of going back to London with you, instead of waiting till the new master comes to take my place."
"Don't do that, sir.
You would do harm instead of good if you showed yourself at the cottage now. Besides, it would not be fair to Miss Ladd
to leave her before the other master takes your girls off your hands. Trust me to look after your interests, and don't go near Miss Emily, don't even write to her, unless you have got something to say about the murder, which she will be eager to hear. Make some discovery in that direction, Mr. Morris. While the parson is only trying to do it, or pretending to do it, and I'll answer for the results. Look at the clock! In 10 minutes more the train will be here. My memory isn't as good as it was, but I do think I have told you all I had to tell. You are the best of good friends, Alban said warmly. Never mind about that, sir. If you want to do a kind thing in return, tell me if you know what has become of Miss de Sor. She has returned to Netherwoods. Ah, Miss Ladd is as good as her word. Would you mind writing to tell me of it, if Miss de Sor leaves the school again? Good Lord! There she is, on the platform with bag and baggage. Don't let her see me, Mr. Morris. If she comes in here, I shall set the marks of my 10 fingernails on that false face of hers, as sure as I am a Christian woman. Alban placed himself at the door so as to hide Mrs. Ellmother. There indeed was Francine, accompanied by one of the teachers at the school. She took a seat on the bench outside the booking-office, in a state of sullen indifference, absorbed in herself, noticing nothing. Urged by ungovernable curiosity, Mrs. Ellmother stole on tiptoe to Alban's side to look at her. To a person acquainted with the circumstances, there could be no possible doubt of what had happened. Francine had failed to excuse herself, and had been dismissed from Miss Ladd's house. "I would have travelled to the world's end," Mrs. Ellmother said, "to see that." She returned to her place in the waiting-room, perfectly satisfied. The teacher noticed Alban on leaving the booking-office after taking the tickets. "I shall be glad," she said, looking toward Francine, "when I have resigned the charge of that young lady to the person who is to receive her in London." "Is she to be sent back to her parents?" Alban asked. "We don't know yet. Miss Ladd will write to St. Domingo by the next mail. In the meantime, her father's agent in London, the same person who pays her allowance, takes care of her until he hears from the West Indies." "Does she consent to this?" "She doesn't seem to care what becomes of her. Miss Ladd has given her every opportunity of explaining and excusing herself, and has produced no impression. You can see the state she is in. Our good mistress, always hopeful even in the worst cases, as you know, thinks she is feeling ashamed of herself, and is too proud and self-willed to own it. My own idea is that some secret disappointment is weighing on her mind. Perhaps I'm wrong." No, Miss Ladd was wrong, and the teacher was right. The passion of revenge, being especially selfish in its nature, is of all passions the narrowest in its range of view. In gratifying her jealous hatred of Emily, Francine had correctly foreseen consequences as they might affect the other object of her enmity, Alban Morris. But she had failed to perceive the imminent danger of another result, which, in a calmer frame of mind, might not have escaped discovery. In triumphing over Emily and Alban, she had been the direct means of inflicting on herself the bitterest of all disappointments. She had brought Emily and Mirabel together. The first forewarning of this catastrophe had reached her on hearing that Mirabel would not return to Monksmoor. Her worst fears had been thereafter confirmed by a letter from Cecilia, which had followed her to Netherwoods. From that moment, she who had made others wretched paid the penalty in suffering as keenly as any that she had inflicted. Completely prostrated, powerless through ignorance of his address in London to make a last appeal to Mirabel, she was literally, as had been said, careless what became of her. When the train approached, She sprang to her feet, advanced to the edge of the platform, and suddenly drew back, shuddering. The teacher looked in terror at Alban. Had the desperate girl meditated throwing herself under the wheels of the engine? The thought had been in both their minds, but neither of them acknowledged it. Francine stepped quietly into the carriage when the train drew up, and laid her head back in a corner and closed her eyes. Mrs. Ellmother took her place in another compartment, and beckoned Alban to speak to her at the window. "Where can I see you when you go to London?" she asked. "At Dr. Alday's house." "On what day?" "On Tuesday next." End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 57. Approaching the End. Alban reached London early enough in the afternoon to find the doctor at his luncheon. "Too late to see Mrs. Ellmother," he announced. "Sit down and have something to eat." "Has she left any message for me?" "A message, my good friend, that you won't like to hear. She is off with her mistress this morning on a visit to Mr. Mirabel's sister." "Does he go with them?" "No, he follows by a later train." "Has Mrs. Ellmother mentioned the address?" "There it is, in her own handwriting." Alban read the address. Mrs. Delvin, The Clink, Belford, Northumberland. "Turn to the back of that bit of paper," the doctor said. "Mrs. Ellmother has written something on it." She had written these words: "No discoveries made by Mr. Mirabel up to this time. Sir Jervis Redwood is dead. The Rookes are believed to be in Scotland, and Miss Emily, if need be, is to help the parson to find them. No news of Miss Jethro." "Now you have got your information," Dr. Alday resumed, "let me have a look at you. You're not in a rage, that's a good sign to begin with." "I'm not the less determined," Alban answered. "To bring Emily to her senses?" the doctor asked. "To do what Mirabel has not done, and then to let her choose between us." Aye, your good opinion of her hasn't altered, though she has treated you so badly." "My good opinion makes allowances for the state of my poor darling's mind, after the shock that has fallen on her," Alban answered quietly. "She is not my Emily now. She will be my Emily yet. I told her I was convinced of it, in the old days at school, and my conviction is as strong as ever. Have you seen her since I have been away at Netherwoods?" "Yes, and she is as angry with me as she is with you." "For the same reason?" No, I heard enough to warn me to hold my tongue. I refused to help her, that's all. You are a man, and you may run risks which no young girl ought to encounter. Do you remember when I asked you to drop all further inquiries into the murder for Emily's sake? The circumstances have altered since that time. Can I be of any use?" "Of the greatest use, if you can give me Miss Jethro's address." "Oh, you mean to begin in that way, do you?" "Yes. You know that Miss Jethro visited me at Netherwoods." "Go on." "She showed me your answer to a letter which she had written to you. Have you got that letter?" Dr. Alday produced it. The address was at a post-office in a town on the south coast. Looking up when he had copied it, Alban saw the doctor's eyes fixed on him, with an oddly mingled expression, partly of sympathy, partly of hesitation. "Have you anything to suggest?" he asked. "You will get nothing out of Miss Jethro," the doctor answered, "unless—" There he stopped. "Unless what?" "Unless you can frighten her. How am I to do that?" After a little reflection, Dr. Alday returned, without any apparent reason, to the subject of his last visit to Emily. "There was one thing she said in the course of our talk," he continued, "which struck me as being sensible. Possibly, for we are all more or less conceited, because I agreed with her myself. She suspects Miss Jethro of knowing more about that damnable murder than Miss Jethro is willing to acknowledge. If you want to produce the right effect on her—" He looked hard at Alban, and checked himself once more. "Well, what am I to do?" "Tell her you have an idea of who the murderer is." "But I have no idea." "But I have." "Good God! What do you mean?" "Don't mistake me. An impression has been produced on my mind, that's all. Call it a freak or fancy. Worth trying, perhaps, as a bold experiment, and worth nothing more. Come a little nearer. My housekeeper is an excellent woman, but I have once or twice caught her rather too near to that door. I think I'll whisper it." He did whisper it. In breathless wonder, Alban heard of the doubt which had crossed Dr. Alday's mind on the evening when Mirabel had called at his house. "You look as if you didn't believe it," the doctor remarked. "I'm thinking of Emily. For her sake, I hope and trust you are wrong. Ought I to go to her at once? I don't know what to do." "Find out first, my good fellow, whether I am right or wrong. You can do it, if you will run the risk with Miss Jethro." Alban recovered himself. His old friend's advice was clearly the right advice to follow. He examined his railway guide, and then looked at his watch. "If I can find Miss Jethro," he answered, "I'll risk it before the day is out." The doctor accompanied him to the door. "You will write to me, won't you?" "Without fail. Thank you, and good-bye." End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Book the 7th. The Clink. Chapter 58. A Council of Two. Early in the last century, one of the picturesque race of robbers and murderers, practising the vices of humanity on the borderlands watered by the river Tweed, built a tower of stone on the coast of Northumberland. He lived joyously in the perpetration of atrocities, and he died penitent under the direction of his priest. Since that event, he has figured in poems and pictures, and has been greatly admired by modern ladies and gentlemen, whom he would have outraged and robbed if he had been lucky enough to meet with them in the good old time. His son succeeded him, and failed to profit by the paternal example. That is to say, he made the fatal mistake of fighting for other people instead of fighting for himself. In the rebellion of '45, this northern squire sided to serious purpose with Prince Charles and the Highlanders. He lost his head, and his children lost their inheritance. In the lapse of years, the confiscated property fell into the hands of strangers, the last of whom, having a taste for the turf, discovered in course of time that he was in want of money. A retired merchant named Delvin, ordinarily of French extraction, took a liking to the wild situation and purchased the tower. His wife, already in failing health, had been ordered by the doctors to live a quiet life by the sea. Her husband's death left her a rich and lonely widow, by day and night alike, a prisoner in her room, wasted by disease, and having but two interests which reconciled her to life: writing poetry in the intervals of pain, and paying the debts of a reverend brother, who succeeded in the pulpit and nowhere else. In the later days of its life, the Tower had been greatly improved as a place of residence. The contrast was remarkable between the dreary grey outer walls and the luxuriously furnished rooms inside, rising by two at a time to the lofty 8th story of the building. Among the scattered populace of the country round, the Tower was still named by the odd name given to it in the bygone time, the Clink. It had been so called, as was supposed, in allusion to the noise made by the loose stones washed backward and forward at certain times of the tide, in hollows of the rock on which the building stood. On the evening of her arrival at Mrs. Delvin's retreat, Emily retired at an early hour, fatigued by her long journey. Mirabel had an opportunity of speaking with his sister privately in her own room. "Send me away, Agatha, if I disturb you," he said, "and let me know when I can see you in the morning." "My dear Miles, have you forgotten that I am never able to sleep in calm weather? My lullaby for years past has been the moaning of the great North Sea under my window. Listen. There is not a sound outside on this peaceful night. It is the right time of the tide just now, and yet the clink is not to be heard. Is the moon up?" Mirabel opened the curtains. "The whole sky is one great abyss of black," he answered. "If I was superstitious, I should think that horrid darkness a bad omen of the future. Are you suffering, Agatha?" "Not just now. I suppose I look sadly changed for the worse since you saw me last." But for the feverish brightness of her eyes, she would have looked like a corpse. Her wrinkled forehead, her hollow cheeks, her white lips, told their terrible tale of the suffering of years. The ghastly appearance of her face was heightened by the furnishing of the room. This doomed woman, dying slowly day by day, delighted in the bright colours and sumptuous materials. The paper on the walls, the curtains, the carpets, presented the hues of the rainbow. She lay on a couch covered with purple silk, under draperies of green velvet to keep her warm. Rich lace hid her scanty hair, turning peremptorily grey. Brilliant rings glittered on her bony fingers. The room was in a blaze of light from lamps and candles. Even the wine at her side, that kept her alive, had been decanted in a bottle of lustrous Venetian glass. "My grave is open," she used to say, "and I want all these beautiful things to keep me from looking at it. I should die at once if I was left in the dark." Her brother sat by the couch, thinking. "Shall I tell you what is in your mind?" she asked. Mirabel humoured the caprice of the moment. "Tell me," he said. "You want to know what I think of Emily," she answered. "Your letter told me you were in love, but I didn't believe your letter. I have always doubted whether you were capable of feeling true love, until I saw Emily. The moment she entered the room, I knew that I had never properly appreciated my brother. You are in love with her, Miles, and you are a better man than I thought you. Does that express my opinion?" Mirabel took her wasted hand and kissed it gratefully. "What a position I am in," he said, "to love her as I love her, and, if she knew the truth, to be the object of her horror, to be the man whom she would hunt to the scaffold as an act of duty to the memory of her father.
"You have left out the worst part of it," Mrs. Delvin reminded him. "You have bound yourself to help her to find the man. Your one hope of persuading her to become your wife rests on your success in finding him. And you are the man. There is your situation. You can't submit to it. How can you escape from it?"
"You are trying to frighten me, Agatha."
"I am trying to encourage you to face your position boldly."
"I'm doing my best," Mirabel said with sullen indignation. "Fortune has favoured me so far. I have really and truly been unable to satisfy Emily by discovering Miss Jethro. She has left the place at which I saw her last. There is no trace to be found of her, and Emily knows it."
"Don't forget," Mrs. Delvin replied, "that there is a trace to be found of Mrs. Rook, and that Emily expects you to follow it."
Mirabel shuddered. "I'm surrounded by dangers, whichever way I look," he said. "Do what I may, it turns out to be wrong. I was wrong, perhaps, when I brought Emily here."
"No."
"I could easily make an excuse," Mirabel persisted, "and take her back to London."
"And for all you know to the contrary," his wise sister replied, "Mrs. Rook may go to London, and you may take Emily back in time to receive her at the cottage. In every way you are safer in my old tower. And don't forget, you have got my money to help you, if you want it. In my belief, Miles, you will want it."
"You are the dearest and best of sisters. What do you recommend me to do?"
"What you would have been obliged to do," Mrs. Delvin answered, "if you had remained in London. You must go to Redwood Hall tomorrow, as Emily has arranged it. If Mrs. Rook is not there, you must ask for her address in Scotland. If nobody knows the address, you must still bestir yourself in trying to find it. And when you do fall in with Mrs. Rook,
"Well?"
"Take care, wherever it may be, that you see her privately."
Mirabel was alarmed. "Don't keep me in suspense," he burst out. "Tell me what you propose."
"Never mind what I propose today. Before I can tell you what I have in mind, I must know whether Mrs. Rook is in England or Scotland. Bring me that information tomorrow, and I shall have something to say to you. Hark! The wind is rising. The rain is falling. There is a chance of sleep for me. I shall soon hear the sea. Good night."
"Good night, dearest, and thank you again and again." End of chapter 58. Chapter 59 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 59. The Accident at Belford. Early in the morning, Mirabel set forth for Redwood Hall, in one of the vehicles which Mrs. Delvin kept at the Clink, for the convenience of visitors. He returned soon after noon, having obtained information of the whereabout of Mrs. Rook and her husband. When they had last been heard of, they were at Luswade, near Edinburgh. Whether they had or had not obtained the situation of which they were in search, neither Miss Redwood nor anyone else at the Hall could tell. In half an hour more, another horse was harnessed, and Mirabel was on his way to the railway station at Belford, to follow Mrs. Rook at Emily's urgent request. Before his departure, he had an interview with his sister. Mrs. Delvin was rich enough to believe implicitly in the power of money. Her method of extricating her brother from the serious difficulties that beset him was to make it worth the while of Mr. and Mrs. Rook to leave England. Their passage to America would be secretly paid, and they would take with them a letter of credit addressed to a banker in New York. If Mirabel failed to discover them after they had sailed, Emily could not blame his want of devotion to her interests. He understood this, but he remained desponding and irresolute, even with the money in his hands. The one person who could rouse his courage and animate his hope was also the one person who must know nothing of what had passed between his sister and himself. He had no choice but to leave Emily, without being cheered by her bright looks, invigorated by her inspiriting words. Mirabel went away on his doubtful errand with a heavy heart. The Clink was so far from the nearest post-town that the few letters usually addressed to the Tower were delivered by private arrangement with a messenger. The man's punctuality depended on the convenience of his superiors employed at the office. Sometimes he arrived early, and sometimes he arrived late. On this particular morning he presented himself at 1:30 with a letter for Emily, and when Mrs. Ellmother smartly reproved him for the delay, he coolly attributed it to the hospitality of friends whom he had met on the road. The letter, directed to Emily at the cottage, had been forwarded from London by the person left in charge. It addressed her as "Honoured Miss." She turned at once to the end, and discovered the signature of Mrs. Rook. "And Mr. Mirabel has gone!" Emily exclaimed, "just when his presence is of the greatest importance to us." Shrewd Mrs. Ellmother suggested that it might be as well to read the letter first, and then form an opinion. Emily read it. "Laswade, near Edinburgh, September 26th. Honoured Miss, I take up my pen to bespeak your kind sympathy for my husband and myself, two old people thrown on the world again by the death of our excellent master. We are under a month's notice to leave Redwood Hall. Hearing of a situation at this place, also that our expenses would be paid if we applied personally, we got leave of absence, and made our application. The lady and her son are either the stingiest people that ever lived, or they have taken a dislike to me and my husband, and they make money a means of getting rid of us easily. Suffice it to say that we have refused to accept starvation wages, and that we are still out of place. It is just possible that you may have heard of something to suit us. So I write at once, knowing that good chances are often lost through needless delay. We stop at Belford on our way back to see some friends of my husband, and we hope to get to Redwood Hall in good time on the 28th. Would you please address me to care of Miss Redwood, in case you know of any good situation for which we could apply. Perhaps we may be driven to try our luck in London. In this case, will you permit me to have the honour of presenting my respects, as I ventured to propose when I wrote to you a little time since? I beg to remain, honoured Miss, your humble servant, R. Rook. Emily handed the letter to Mrs. Ellmother. "Read it," she said, "and tell me what you think." "I think you had better be careful." "Careful of Mrs. Rook?" "Yes, and careful of Mrs. Delvin, too." Emily was astonished. "Are you really speaking seriously?" she said. "Mrs. Delvin is a most interesting person, so patient under her sufferings, so kind, so clever, so interested in all that interests me. I shall take the letter to her at once, and ask her advice." "Have your own way, miss. I can't tell you why, but I don't like her." Mrs. Delvin's devotion to the interests of her guest took even Emily by surprise. After reading Mrs. Rook's letter, she rang the bell on her table in a frenzy of impatience. "My brother must be instantly recalled," she said. "Telegraph to him in your own name, telling him what has happened. He will find the message waiting for him at the end of his journey." The groom, summoned by the bell, was ordered to saddle the third and last horse left in the stables, to take the telegram to Belford, and to wait there until the answer arrived. "How far is it to Redwood Hall?" Emily asked, when the man had received his orders. 10 miles, Mrs. Delvin answered. "How can I get there today?" "My dear, you can't get there." "Pardon me, Mrs. Delvin, I must get there." "Pardon me. My brother represents you in this matter. Leave it to my brother." The tone taken by Mirabel's sister was positive, to say the least of it. Emily thought of what her faithful old servant had said, and began to doubt her own discretion in so readily showing the letter. The mistake, if a mistake it was, had, however, been committed, and, wrong or right, she was not disposed to occupy the subordinate position which Mrs. Delvin had assigned to her. "If you will look at Mrs. Rook's letter again," Emily replied, "you will see that I ought to answer it. She supposes I am in London." "Do you propose to tell Mrs. Rook that you are in this house?" Mrs. Delvin asked. "Certainly." "You had better consult my brother before you take any responsibility on yourself." Emily kept her temper. "Allow me to remind you," she said, "that Mr. Mirabel is not acquainted with Mrs. Rook, and I am. If I speak to her personally, I can do much to assist the object of our inquiries before he returns. She is not an easy woman to deal with, and therefore," Mrs. Delvin interposed, "the sort of person who requires careful handling by a man like my brother, a man of the world. The sort of person, as I venture to think," Emily persisted, "whom I ought to see with as little loss of time as possible." Mrs. Delvin waited a while before she replied. In her condition of health, anxiety was not easy to bear. Mrs. Rook's letter and Emily's obstinacy had seriously irritated her, but, like all persons of ability, she was capable, when there was serious occasion for it, of exerting self-control. She really liked and admired Emily, and, as the older woman and the hostess, she set an example of forbearance and good humour. "It is out of my power to send you to Redwood Hall at once," she resumed. "The only one of my 3 horses now at your disposal is the horse which took my brother to the Hall this morning, a distance there and back of 20 miles. You are not in too great a hurry, I am sure, to allow the horse time to rest." Emily made her excuses with perfect grace and sincerity. "I had no idea the distance was so great," she confessed. "I will wait, dear Mrs. Delvin, as long as you like." They parted as good friends as ever, with a certain reserve, nevertheless, on either side. Emily's eager nature was depressed and irritated by the prospect of delay. Mrs. Delvin, on the other hand, devoted to her brother's interests, thought hopefully of obstacles which might present themselves with the lapse of time. The horse might prove to be incapable of further exertion for that day, or the threatening aspect of the weather might end in a storm. But the hours passed, and the sky cleared, and the horse was reported to be fit for work again. Fortune was against the lady of the tower. She had no choice but to submit. Mrs. Delvin had just sent word to Emily that the carriage would be ready for her in 10 minutes, when the coachman who had driven Mirabel to Belford returned. He brought news which agreeably surprised both the ladies. Mirabel had reached the station 5 minutes too late. The coachman had left him waiting the arrival of the next train to the north. He would now receive the telegraphic message at Belford, and might return immediately by taking the groom's horse. Mrs. Delvin left it to Emily to decide whether she would proceed by herself to Redwood Hall, or wait for Mirabel's return. Under the changed circumstances, Emily would have acted ungraciously if she had persisted in holding to her first intention. She consented to wait. The sea remained calm. The stillness of the moorland solitude on the western side of the Clink. The rapid steps of a horse were heard at some little distance on the high road. Emily ran out, followed by careful Mrs. Ellmother, expecting to meet Mirabel. She was disappointed. It was the groom who had returned. As he pulled up at the house and dismounted, Emily noticed that the man looked excited. "Is there anything wrong?" she asked. "There has been an accident, miss." "Not to Mr. Mirabel?" No, miss. An accident to a poor foolish woman, travelling from Lasswade." Emily looked at Mrs. Ellmother. "It can't be Mrs. Rook," she said. "That's the name, miss. She got out before the train had quite stopped, and fell on the platform." "Was she hurt?" "Seriously hurt, as I heard. They carried her into a house hard by, and sent for the doctor." "Was Mr. Mirabel one of the people who helped her?" "He was on the other side of the platform, miss, waiting for the train from London. I got to the station and gave him the telegram just as the accident took place. We crossed over to hear more about it. Mr. Mirabel was telling me that he would return to the Clink on my horse when he heard the woman's name mentioned. Upon that, he changed his mind and went to the house." "Was he let in?" "The doctor wouldn't hear of it. He was making his examination, and he said nobody was to be in the room but her husband and the woman of the house." "Is Mr. Mirabel waiting to see her?" "Yes, miss. He said he would wait all day, if necessary, and he gave me this bit of a note to take to the mistress." Emily turned to Mrs. Ellmother. "It's impossible to stay here, not knowing whether Mrs. Rook is going to live or die," she said. "I shall go to Belford, and you will go with me." The groom interfered. "I beg your pardon, miss. It was Mr. Mirabel's most particular wish that you were not on any account to go to Belford." "Why not?" "He didn't say." Emily eyed the note in the groom's hand with well-grounded distrust. In all probability, Mirabel's object in writing was to instruct his sister to prevent her guest from going to Belford. The carriage was waiting at the door. With her usual promptness of resolution, Emily decided on taking it for granted that she was free to use as she pleased the carriage which had been already placed at her disposal. "Tell your mistress," she said to the groom, "that I am going to Belford instead of to Redwood Hall." In a minute more, she and Mrs. Ellmother were on their way to join Mirabel at the station. End of chapter 59. Chapter 60 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 60. Outside the Room. Emily found Mirabel in the waiting room at Belford. Her sudden appearance might well have amazed him, but his face expressed a more serious emotion than surprise. He looked at her as if she had alarmed him. "Didn't you get my message?" he asked. "I told the groom I wished you to wait for my return. I sent a note to my sister in case he made any mistake." "The man made no mistake," Emily answered. "I was in too great a hurry to be able to speak with Mrs. Delvin. Did you really suppose I could endure the suspense of waiting till you came back? Do you think I could be of no use, I who know Mrs. Rook?" "They won't let you see her." "Why not? You seem to be waiting to see her." "I am waiting for the return of the rector of Belford. He is at Berwick, and he has been sent for at Mrs. Rook's urgent request." "Is she dying?"
"She is in fear of death."
"Whether rightly or wrongly, I don't know. There is some internal injury from the fall. I hope to see her when the rector returns. As a brother clergyman, I may, with perfect propriety, ask him to use his influence in my favour."
"I am glad to find you so eager about it."
"I am always eager in your interests."
"Don't think me ungrateful," Emily replied gently.
"I am no stranger to Mrs. Rook,
and if I send in my name, I may be able to see her before the clergyman returns." She stopped. Mirabel suddenly moved, so as to place himself between her and the door. "I must really beg of you to give up that idea," he said. "You don't know what horrid sight you may see, what dreadful agonies of pain this unhappy woman may be suffering." His manner suggested to Emily that he might be acting under some motive which he was unwilling to acknowledge. "If you have a reason for wishing that I should keep away from Mrs. Rook," she said,
"let me hear what it is."
"Surely we trust each other. I have done my best to set the example, at any rate." Mirabel seemed to be at a loss for a reply. While he was hesitating, the station-master passed the door. Emily asked him to direct her to the house in which Mrs. Rook had been received. He led the way to the end of the platform and pointed to the house. Emily and Mrs. Ellmother immediately left the station. Mirabel accompanied them, still remonstrating, still raising obstacles. The house door was opened by an old man. He looked reproachfully at Mirabel. "You have been told already," he said, "that no strangers are to see my wife." Encouraged by discovering that the man was Mr. Rook, Emily mentioned her name. "Perhaps you may have heard Mrs. Rook speak of me," she added.
"I've heard her speak of you oftentimes."
"What does the doctor say?"
"He thinks she may get over it. She doesn't believe him."
"Will you say that I am anxious to see her, if she feels well enough to receive me?"
Mr. Rook looked at Mrs. Ellmother. "Are there two of you wanting to go upstairs?" he inquired.
"This is my old friend and servant," Emily answered. "She will wait for me down here."
"She can wait in the parlour. The good people of this house are well known to me."
He pointed to the parlour door, and then led the way to the first floor. Emily followed him. Mirabel, as obstinate as ever, followed Emily. Mr. Rook opened a door at the end of the landing, and, turning round to speak to Emily, noticed Mirabel standing behind her. Without making any remarks, the old man pointed significantly down the stairs. His resolution was evidently immovable. Mirabel appealed to Emily to help him. "She will see me if you ask her," he said. "Let me wait here." The sound of his voice was instantly followed by a cry from the bedchamber, a cry of terror. Mr. Rook hurried into the room and closed the door. In less than a minute he opened it again, with doubt and horror plainly visible in his face. He stepped up to Mirabel, eyed him with the closest scrutiny, and drew back again with a look of relief.
"'Tis wrong," he said. "You are not the man."
This strange proceeding startled Emily. "What man do you mean?" she asked. Mr. Rook took no notice of the question. Still looking at Mirabel, he pointed down the stairs once more. With vacant eyes, moving mechanically like a sleep-walker in his dream, Mirabel silently obeyed. Mr. Rook turned to Emily.
"Are you easily frightened?" he said.
"I don't understand you," Emily replied.
Who is going to frighten me? Why do you speak to Mr. Mirabel in that strange way?" Mr. Rook looked toward the bedroom door. "Maybe you'll hear why inside there. If I could have my way, you wouldn't see her, but she's not to be reasoned with. A caution, miss. Don't be too ready to believe what my wife may say to you. She's had a fright." He opened the door. "In my belief," he whispered, "she's off her head." Emily crossed the threshold. Mr. Rook softly closed the door behind her. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 61. Inside the Room. A decent elderly woman was seated at the bedside. She rose and spoke to Emily with a mingling of sorrow and confusion strikingly expressed on her face. "It isn't my fault," she said, "that Mrs. Rook receives you in this manner. I am obliged to humour her." She drew aside and showed Mrs. Rook with her head supported by many pillows, and her face strangely hidden from view under a veil. Emily started back in horror. "Is her face injured?" she asked. Mrs. Rook answered the question herself. Her voice was low and weak, but she still spoke with the same nervous hurry of articulation which had been remarked by Alban Morris on the day when she asked him to direct her to Netherwoods. "Not exactly injured," she explained, "but one's appearance is a matter of some anxiety, even on one's deathbed. I am disfigured by thoughtless use of water to bring me to, when I had my fall, and I can't get my toilet things to put myself right again. I don't wish to shock you. Please excuse the veil." Emily remembered the rouge on her cheeks and the dye on her hair when they had first seen each other at the school. Vanity, of all human frailties the longest lived, still held its firmly rooted place in this woman's nature, superior to torment of conscience, unassailable by terror of death. The good woman of the house waited a moment before she left the room. "What shall I say," she asked, "if the clergyman comes?" Mrs. Rook lifted her hand solemnly. "Say," she answered, "that a dying sinner is making atonement for sin. Say this young lady is present by the decree of an all-wise Providence. No mortal creature must disturb us." Her hand dropped back heavily on the bed. "Are we alone?" she asked. "We are alone," Emily answered. "What made you scream just before I came in?" "No, I can't allow you to remind me of that," Mrs. Rook protested. "I must compose myself. Be quiet. Let me think." Recovering her composure, she also recovered that sense of enjoyment in talking of herself which was one of the marked peculiarities in her character. "You will excuse me if I exhibit religion," she resumed. "My dear parents were exemplary people. I was most carefully brought up. Are you pious? Let us hope so." Emily was once more reminded of the past. The bygone time returned to her memory, the time when she had accepted Sir Jervis Redwood's offer of employment, and when Mrs. Rook had arrived at the school to be her travelling companion to the north. The wretched creature had entirely forgotten her own loose talk after she had drunk Miss Ladd's good wine to the last drop in the bottle. As she was boasting now of her piety, so she had boasted then of her lost faith and hope, and had mockingly declared her free-thinking opinions to be the result of her ill-assorted marriage. Forgotten, all forgotten in this later time of pain and fear. Prostrate under the dread of death, her innermost nature, stripped of the concealments of her later life, was revealed to view. The early religious training at which she had scoffed in the insolence of health and strength revealed its latent influence, intermitted, but a living influence always from first to last. Mrs. Rook was tenderly mindful of her exemplary parents, and proud of exhibiting religion on the bed from which she was never to rise again. "Did I tell you that I am a miserable sinner?" she asked after an interval of silence. Emily could endure it no longer. "Say that to the clergyman," she answered, "not to me." "Oh, but I must say it," Mrs. Rook insisted. "I am a miserable sinner. Let me give you an instance of it," she continued, with a shameless relish of the memory of her own frailties. "I have been a drinker in my time. Anything was welcome, when the fit was on me, as long as it got into my head. Like other persons in liquor, I sometimes talked of things that had better have been kept secret. We bore that in mind, my old man and I, when we were engaged by Sir Jervis. Miss Redwood wanted to put us in the next bedroom to hers, a risk not to be run. I might have talked of the murder at the inn, and she might have heard me, pleased to remark a curious thing. Whatever else I might have let out when I was in my cup, not a word about the pocket-book ever dropped from me. You will ask how I know it. My dear, I should have heard it from my husband if I had let that out, and he is as much in the dark as you are. Wonderful are the workings of the human mind, as the poet says, and drink drowns care, as the proverb says. But can drink deliver a person from fear by day and fear by night? I believe if I had dropped a word about the pocket-book, it would have sobered me in an instant. Have you any remark to make on this curious circumstance?" Thus far, Emily had allowed the woman to ramble on, in the hope of getting information which direct inquiry might fail to produce. It was impossible, however, to pass over the allusion to the pocket-book. After giving her time to recover from the exhaustion which her heavy breathing sufficiently revealed, Emily put the question, "Who did the pocket-book belong to?" "Wait a little," said Mrs. Rook. "Everything in its right place is my motto. I mustn't begin with the pocket-book. Why did I begin with it? Do you think this veil on my face confuses me? Suppose I take it off. But you must promise first, solemnly promise, you won't look at my face. How can I tell you about the murder? The murder is part of my confession, you know, with this lace tickling my skin. Go away, and stand there with your back to me. Thank you. Now, I'll take it off. The air feels refreshing. I know what I am about. Good heavens, I have forgotten something. I have forgotten him, and first such a fright as he gave me. Did you see him on the landing?" "Who are you talking of?" Emily asked. Mrs. Rook's failing voice sank lower still. "Come closer," she said. "This must be whispered. Who am I talking of?" she repeated. "I am talking of the man who slept in the other bed at the inn, the man who did the deed with his own razor. He was gone when I looked into the outhouse in the grey of the morning. Oh, I have done my duty. I have told Mr. Rook to keep an eye on him downstairs. You haven't an idea how obstinate and stupid my husband is. He says I couldn't know the man because I didn't see him. There's such a thing as hearing when you don't see. I heard, and I knew it again." Emily turned cold from head to foot. "What did you know again?" she said. "His voice. Mrs. Rook answered. I'll swear to his voice, before all the judges in England. Emily rushed to the bed. She looked at the woman who had said those dreadful words, speechless with horror. "You're breaking your promise!" cried Mrs. Rook. "You false girl! You're breaking your promise!" She snatched at the veil and put it on again. The sight of her face, momentary as it had been, reassured Emily. Her wild eyes, made wilder still by the blurred stains of rouge below them, half washed away, her dishevelled hair with streaks of grey showing through the dye, presented a spectacle which would have been grotesque under other circumstances, but which now reminded Emily of Mr. Rook's last words, warning her not to believe what his wife said, and even declaring his conviction that her intellect was deranged. Emily drew back from the bed, conscious of an overpowering sense of self-reproach. Although it was only for a moment, she had allowed her faith in Mirabel to be shaken by a woman who was out of her mind. "Try to forgive me," she said. "I didn't willingly break my promise. You frightened me." Mrs. Rook began to cry. "I was a handsome woman in my time," she murmured. "You would say I was handsome still, if the clumsy fools about me had not spoiled my appearance. Oh, I do feel so weak. Where's my medicine?" The bottle was on the table. Emily gave her the prescribed dose, and revived her failing strength. "I am an extraordinary person," she resumed. "My resolution has always been the admiration of everyone who knew me. But my mind feels, how shall I express it, a little vacant. Have mercy on my poor wicked soul. Help me." "How can I help you?" "I want to recollect. Something happened in the summer-time when we were talking at Netherwoods. I mean, when that impudent master at the school showed his suspicions of me. Lord, how he frightened me when he turned up afterward at Sir Jervis's house. You must have seen yourself. He suspected me. How did he show it?" "He showed you my locket," Emily answered. "Oh, the horrid reminder of the murder!" Mrs. Rook exclaimed. "I didn't mention it. Don't blame me. You poor innocent, I have something dreadful to tell you." Emily's horror of the woman forced her to speak. "Don't tell me," she cried. "I know more than you suppose. I know what I was ignorant of when you saw the locket." Mrs. Rook took offence at the interruption. "Clever as you are, there's one thing you don't know," she said. "You asked me, just now, who the pocket-book belonged to. It belonged to your father. What's the matter? Are you crying?" Emily was thinking of her father. The pocket-book was the last present she had given to him. A present on his birthday. "Is it lost?" she asked sadly. "No, it's not lost. You will hear more of it directly. Dry your eyes, and expect something interesting. I'm going to talk about love. Love, my dear, means myself. Why shouldn't it? I'm not the only nice-looking woman married to an old man who has had a lover. Wretch, what has that got to do with it? Everything, you rude girl. My lover was like the rest of them. He would bet on race-horses, and he lost. He owned it to me. On the day when your father came to our inn, he said, 'I must find the money, or be off to America, and say good-bye forever.' I was fool enough to be fond of him. It broke my heart to hear him talk in that way. I said, 'If I find the money, and more than the money, will you take me with you, wherever you go?' Of course he said yes. I suppose you have heard of the inquest held at our old place by the coroner and jury. Oh, what idiots! They believed I was asleep on the night of the murder. I never closed my eyes. I was so miserable. I was so tempted. Tempted? What tempted you? Do you think I had any money to spare? Your father's pocket-book tempted me. I had seen him open it to pay his bill overnight. It was full of banknotes. Oh, what an overpowering thing love is! Perhaps you have known it yourself? Emily's indignation once more got the better of her prudence. Have you no feeling of decency on your deathbed? She said. Mrs. Rook forgot her piety. She was ready with an impudent rejoinder. You hot-headed little woman, your time will come, she answered. But you're right. I am wandering from the point. I am not sufficiently sensible of this solemn occasion. By the by, do you notice my language? I inherit correct English from my mother, a cultivated person who married beneath her. My paternal grandfather was a gentleman. Did I tell you that there came a time, on that dreadful night, when I could stay in bed no longer? The pocket-book. I did nothing but think of that devilish pocket-book, full of banknotes. My husband was fast asleep all the time. I got a chair and stood on it. I looked into the place where the two men were sleeping, through the glass in the top of the door. Your father was awake. He was walking up and down the room. What do you say? Was he agitated? I didn't notice. I don't know whether the other man was asleep or awake. I saw nothing but the pocket-book stuck under the pillow, half in and half out. Your father kept on walking up and down. I thought to myself, I'll wait till he gets tired, and then I'll have another look at the pocket-book. Where's the wine? The doctor said I might have a glass of wine when I wanted it. Emily found the wine and gave it to her. She shuddered as she accidentally touched Mrs. Rook's hand. The wine helped the sinking woman. I must have got up more than once, she resumed, and more than once my heart must have failed me. I don't clearly remember what I did till the grey of the morning came. I think that must have been the last time I looked through the glass in the door. She began to tremble. She tore the veil off her face. She cried out piteously, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. Come here, she said to Emily. Where are you? No, I daren't tell you what I saw. I daren't tell you what I did. When you're possessed by the devil, there's nothing you can't do. Where did I find the courage to unlock the door? Where did I find the courage to go in? Any other woman would have lost her senses when she found blood on her fingers after taking the pocket-book. Emily's head swam. Her heart beat furiously. She staggered to the door and opened it to escape from the room. I'm guilty of robbing him, but I'm innocent of his blood, Mrs. Rook called after her wildly. The deed was done. The yard door was wide open, and the man was gone when I looked in for the last time. Come back! Come back! Emily looked round. I can't go near you, she said faintly. Come near enough to see this. She opened her bedgown at the throat and drew out a loop of ribbon over her head. The pocket-book was attached to the ribbon. She held it out. Your father's book, she said. Won't you take your father's book? For a moment, and only for a moment, Emily was repelled by the profanation associated with her birthday gift. Then the loving remembrance of the dear hands that had so often touched that relic drew the faithful daughter back to the woman whom she abhorred. Her eyes rested tenderly on the book. Before it had lain in that guilty bosom, it had been his book. The beloved memory was all that was left to her now. The beloved memory consecrated it to her hand. She took the book. "Open it," said Mrs. Rook. There were 2 5-pound notes in it. "His?" Emily asked. "No, mine. The little I have been able to save toward restoring what I stole." "Oh!" Emily cried. "Is there some good in this woman after all?" "There's no good in the woman," Mrs. Rook answered desperately. "There's nothing but fear. Fear of hell now. Fear of the pocket-book in the past time. Twice I tried to destroy it, and twice it came back to remind me of the duty that I owe to my miserable soul. I tried to throw it into the fire. It struck the bar and fell back into the fender at my feet. I went out and cast it into the well. It came back again in the first bucket of water that was drawn up. From that moment I began to say what I could. Restitution. Atonement. I tell you, the book found a tongue, and those were the grand words it dinned in my ears, morning and night." She stopped to fetch her breath, stopped and struck her bosom. "I hid it here, so that no person should see it, and no person take it from me. Superstition? Oh, yes, superstition shall tell you something. You may find yourself superstitious if you are ever cut to the heart as I was. He left me. The man I had disgraced myself for deserted me on the day when I gave him the stolen money. He suspected it was stolen. He took care of his own cowardly self, and left me to the hard mercy of the law. If the theft was found out, what do you call that in the way of punishment? Haven't I suffered? Haven't I made atonement? Be a Christian. Say you forgive me. I do forgive you. Say you will pray for me. I will. Ah, that comforts me. Now you can go." Emily looked at her imploringly. "Don't send me away, knowing no more of the murder than I knew when I came in. Is there nothing, really nothing you can tell me?" Mrs. Rook pointed to the door. "Haven't I told you already? Go downstairs and see the wretch who escaped in the dawn of the morning." "Gently, ma'am, gently. You're talking too loudly," cried a mocking voice from outside. "It's only the doctor," said Mrs. Rook. She crossed her hands over her bosom with a deep-drawn sigh. "I want no doctor now. My peace is made with my Maker. I'm ready for death. I'm fit for heaven. Go away. Go away." End of chapter 61. Chapter 62 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 62. Downstairs. In a moment more the doctor came in, a brisk, smiling, self-sufficient man, smartly dressed, with a flower in his buttonhole. A stifling odour of musk filled the room as he drew out his handkerchief with a flourish and wiped his forehead. "Plenty of hard work in my line just now," he said. "Hullo, Mrs. Rook. Somebody has been allowing you to excite yourself. I heard you before I opened the door. Have you been encouraging her to talk?" he asked, turning to Emily and shaking his finger at her, with an air of facetious remonstrance. Incapable of answering him, forgetful of the ordinary restraints of social intercourse, with the one doubt that preserved her belief in Mirabel, eager for confirmation, Emily signed to the stranger to follow her into a corner of the room, out of hearing. She made no excuses. She took no notice of his look of surprise. One hope was all she could feel. One word was all she could say after that second assertion of Mirabel's guilt. Indicating Mrs. Rook by a glance at the bed, she whispered the word. "Mad?" Flippant and familiar, the doctor imitated her. He, too, looked at the bed. "No more mad than you are, miss. As I said just now, my patient has been exciting herself. I dare say she has talked a little wildly in consequence. Hers isn't a brain to give way, I can tell you. But there's somebody else." Emily had fled from the room. He had destroyed her last fragment of belief in Mirabel's innocence. She was on the landing, trying to console herself, when the doctor joined her. "Are you acquainted with the gentleman downstairs?" he asked. "What gentleman?" "I haven't heard his name. He looks like a clergyman. If you know him—" "I do know him. I can't answer questions. My mind—" "Steady your mind, miss, and take your friend home as soon as you can. He hasn't got Mrs. Rook's hard brain. He's in a state of nervous prostration, which may end badly. Do you know where he lives?" "He is staying with his sister, Mrs. Delvin." "Mrs. Delvin, she's a friend and patient of mine. Say I'll look in to-morrow morning, and see what I can do for her brother. In the meantime, get him to bed and to rest, and don't be afraid of giving him brandy." The doctor returned to the bedroom. Emily heard Mrs. Ellmother's voice below. "Are you up there, miss?" "Yes." Mrs. Ellmother ascended the stairs. "It was an evil hour," she said, "that you insisted on going to this place. Mr. Mirabel—" The sight of Emily's face suspended the next words on her lips. She took the poor young mistress in her motherly arms. "Oh, my child, what has happened to you? Don't ask me now. Give me your arm. Let us go downstairs. You won't be startled when you see Mr. Mirabel, will you, my dear? I wouldn't let them disturb you. I said nobody should speak to you before myself. The truth is, Mr. Mirabel has had a dreadful fright. What are you looking for?" "Is there a garden here? Any place where we can breathe the fresh air?" There was a courtyard at the back of the house. They found their way to it. A bench was placed against one of the walls. They sat down. "Shall I wait till you're better before I say any more?" Mrs. Ellmother asked. "No. You want to hear about Mr. Mirabel?" "My dear, he came into the parlour where I was, and Mr. Rook came in too, and waited, looking at him. Mr. Mirabel sat down in a corner in a dazed state, as I thought. It wasn't for long. He jumped up and clapped his hand on his heart, as if his heart hurt him. 'I must and will know what's going on upstairs,' he says. Mr. Rook pulled him back and told him to wait till the young lady came down. Mr. Mirabel wouldn't hear of it. 'Your wife's frightening her,' he says. 'Your wife's telling her horrible things about me.' He was taken on a sudden with a shivering fit. His eyes rolled and his teeth chattered. Mr. Rook made matters worse. He lost his temper. 'I'm damned,' he says, 'if I don't begin to think you are the man after all. I've half a mind to send for the police.' Mr. Mirabel dropped into his chair. His eyes stared, his mouth fell open. I took hold of his hand. Cold, cold as ice. What it all meant I can't say. Oh, miss, you know. Let me tell you the rest some other time." Emily insisted on hearing more. "The end!" she cried. "How did it end?" "I don't know how it might have ended if the doctor hadn't come in to pay his visit, upstairs. He said some learned words. When he came to plain English, he asked if anybody had frightened the gentleman. I said Mr. Rook had frightened him. The doctor says to Mr. Rook, 'Mind what you are about. If you frighten him again, you may have his death to answer for.' That cowed Mr. Rook. He asked what he had better do. 'Give me some brandy for him first,' says the doctor, and then get him home at once. I found the brandy and went away to the inn to order the carriage. Your ears are quicker than mine, miss. Do I hear it now? They rose and went to the house door. The carriage was there. Still cowed by what the doctor had said, Mr. Rook appeared, carefully leading Mirabel out. He had revived under the action of the stimulant. Passing Emily, he raised his eyes to her, trembled, and looked down again. When Mr. Rook opened the door of the carriage, he paused with one of his feet on the step. A momentary impulse inspired him with a false courage, and brought a flush into his ghastly face. He turned to Emily. "May I speak to you?" he asked. She started back from him. He looked at Mrs. Ellmother. "Tell her I am innocent," he said. The trembling seized on him again. Mr. Rook was obliged to lift him into the carriage. Emily caught at Mrs. Ellmother's arm. "You go with him," she said. "I can't." "How are you to get back, miss?" She turned away and spoke to the coachman. "I'm not very well. I want the fresh air. I'll sit by you." Mrs. Ellmother remonstrated and protested in vain. As Emily had determined it should be, so it was. "Has he said anything?" she asked when they had arrived at their journey's end. "He has been like a man frozen up. He hasn't said a word. He hasn't even moved." "Take him to his sister, and tell her all that you know. Be careful to repeat what the doctor said. I can't face Mrs. Delvin. Be patient, my good old friend. I have no secrets from you. Only wait till tomorrow, and leave me by myself tonight." Alone in her room, Emily opened her writing-case. Searching among the letters in it, she drew out a printed paper. It was the handbill, describing the man who had escaped from the inn, and offering a reward for the discovery of him. At the first line of the personal description of the fugitive, the paper dropped from her hand. Burning tears forced their way into her eyes. Feeling for her handkerchief, she touched the pocket-book, which she had received from Mrs. Rook. After a little hesitation, she took it out. She looked at it. She opened it. The sight of the bank-notes repelled her. She hid them in one of the pockets of the book. There was a second pocket, which she had not yet examined. She put her hand into it and touched something, drew out a letter. The envelope, already open, was addressed to James Brown, Esquire, Post Office, Zealand. Would it be inconsistent with her respect for her father's memory to examine the letter? No. A glance would decide whether she ought to read it or not. It was without date or address. A startling letter to look at, for it only contained 3 words. "I say no." The words were signed in initials, S.J. In the instant when she read the initials, the name occurred to her. Sarah Jethro. End of chapter 62. Chapter 63 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 63. The Defense of Mirabel. The discovery of the letter gave a new direction to Emily's thoughts, and so, for the time at least, relieved her mind from the heavy burden that weighed on it. To what question on her father's part had "I say no" been Miss Jethro's brief and stern reply? Neither letter nor envelope offered the slightest hint that might assist inquiry. Even the postmark had been so carelessly impressed that it was illegible. Emily was still pondering over the 3 mysterious words when she was interrupted by Mrs. Ellmother's voice at the door. "I must ask you to let me come in, miss, though I know you wished to be left by yourself till tomorrow. Mrs. Delvin says you must positively see her tonight. It's my belief that she will send for the servants and have herself carried in here if you refuse to do as she asks. You needn't be afraid of seeing Mr. Mirabel." "Where is he?" "His sister has given up her room to him," Mrs. Ellmother answered. "She thought of your feelings before she sent me here, and had the curtains closed between the sitting-room and the bedroom. I suspect my nasty temper misled me when I took a dislike to Mrs. Delvin. She's a good creature. I'm sorry you didn't go to her as soon as we got back." "Did you seem angry when she sent you here?" "Angry? She was crying when I left her." Emily hesitated no longer. She noticed a remarkable change in the invalid's sitting-room, so brilliantly lighted on other occasions the moment she entered it. The lamps were shaded, and the candles were all extinguished. "My eyes don't bear the light so well as usual," Mrs. Delvin said. "Come and sit near me, Emily. I hope to quiet your mind. I should be grieved if you left my house with a wrong impression of me." Knowing what she knew, suffering as she must have suffered, the quiet kindness of her tone implied an exercise of self-restraint which appealed irresistibly to Emily's sympathies. "Forgive me," she said, "for having done you an injustice. I am ashamed to think that I shrank from seeing you when I returned from Belford. I will endeavour to be worthy of your better opinion of me," Mrs. Delvin replied. "In one respect at least I may claim to have had your best interests at heart. While we were still personally strangers, I tried to prevail on my poor brother to own the truth when he discovered the terrible position in which he was placed toward you. He was too conscious of the absence of any proof which might induce you to believe him if he attempted to defend himself. In one word, he was too timid to take my advice. He has paid the penalty, and I have paid the penalty of deceiving you." Emily started. "In what way have you deceived me?" she asked. "In the way that was forced on us by our own conduct," Mrs. Delvin said. "We have appeared to help you without really doing so. We calculated on inducing you to marry my brother, and then, when he could speak with the authority of a husband, on prevailing on you to give up all further inquiries. When you insisted on seeing Mrs. Rook, Miles had the money in his hand to bribe her and her husband to leave England." "Oh, Mrs. Delvin!" "I don't attempt to excuse myself. I don't expect you to consider how sorely I was tempted to secure the happiness of my brother's life by marriage with such a woman as yourself. I don't remind you that I knew, when I put obstacles in your way, that you were blindly devoting yourself to the discovery of an innocent man." Emily heard her with angry surprise. "Innocent!" she repeated. "Mrs. Rook recognized his voice the instant she heard him speak." Impenetrable to interruption, Mrs. Delvin went on. "But what I do ask," she persisted, "even after our short acquaintance, is this. Do you suspect me of deliberately scheming to make you the wife of a murderer?" Emily had never viewed the serious question between them in this light. Warmly, generously, she answered the appeal that had been made to her. "Oh, don't think that of me. I know I spoke thoughtlessly and cruelly just now." "You spoke impulsively," Mrs. Delvin interposed. "That was all. My one desire before we part, how can I expect you to remain here after what has happened, is to tell you the truth. I have no interested object in view, for all hope of your marriage with my brother is at an end. May I ask if you have heard that he and your father were strangers when they met at the inn?" "Yes, I know that." "If there had been any conversation between them when they retired to rest, they might have mentioned their names. But your father was preoccupied, and my brother, after a long day's walk, was so tired that he fell asleep as soon as his head was on the pillow. He only woke when the morning dawned. What he saw when he looked toward the opposite bed might have struck with terror the boldest man that ever lived. His first impulse was naturally to alarm the house. When he got on his feet, he saw his own razor, a blood-stained razor, on the bed by the side of the corpse. At that discovery, he lost all control over himself. In a panic of terror, he snatched up his knapsack, unfastened the yard door, and fled from the house. Knowing him as you and I know him, can we wonder at it? Many a man has been hanged for murder on circumstantial evidence less direct than the evidence against poor Miles. His horror of his own recollections was so overpowering that he forbade me even to mention the inn at Zealand in my letters while he was abroad. "Never tell me," he wrote, "who that wretched murdered stranger was. If I only heard of his name, I believe it would haunt me till my dying day." I ought not to trouble you with these details, and yet I am surely not without excuse. In the absence of any proof, I cannot expect you to believe, as I do, in my brother's innocence, but I may at least hope to show you that there is some reason for doubt. Will you give him the benefit of that doubt? "Willingly," Emily replied. "Am I right in supposing that you don't despair of proving his innocence even yet?" "I don't quite despair, but my hopes have grown fainter and fainter as the years have gone on. There is a person associated with his escape from Zealand, a person named Jethro." "You mean Miss Jethro?" "Yes. Do you know her?" "I know her, and my father knew her. I have found a letter addressed to him, which I have no doubt was written by Miss Jethro. It is barely possible that you may understand what it means. Pray look at it." "I am quite unable to help you," Mrs. Delvin answered, after reading the letter. "All I know of Miss Jethro is that, but for her interposition, my brother might have fallen into the hands of the police. She saved him, knowing him, of course. That is the remarkable part of it. They were perfect strangers to each other." "But she must have had some motive." "There is the foundation of my hope for Miles. Miss Jethro declared when I wrote and put the question to her that the one motive by which she was actuated was the motive of mercy. I don't believe her. To my mind, it is in the last degree improbable that she would consent to protect a stranger from discovery who owned to her, as my brother did, that he was a fugitive suspected of murder. She knows something, I am firmly convinced, of that dreadful event at Zealand, and she has some reason for keeping it secret. Have you any influence over her?" "Tell me where I can find her." "I can't tell you. She has removed from the address at which my brother saw her last. He has made every possible inquiry without result." As she replied in those discouraging terms, the curtains which divided Mrs. Delvin's bedroom from her sitting-room were drawn aside. An elderly woman-servant approached her mistress's couch. "Mr. Mirabel is awake, ma'am. He is very low. I can hardly feel his pulse. Shall I give him some more brandy?" Mrs. Delvin held out her hand to Emily. "Come to me tomorrow morning," she said, and signed to the servant to wheel her couch into the next room. As the curtains closed over them, Emily heard Mirabel's voice. "Where am I?" he said faintly. "Is it all a dream?" The prospect of his recovery the next morning was gloomy indeed. He had sunk into a state of deplorable weakness, in mind as well as in body. The little memory of events that he still preserved was regarded by him as the memory of a dream. He alluded to Emily, and to his meeting with her unexpectedly. But from that point his recollection failed him. They had talked of something interesting, he said, but he was unable to remember what it was. And they had waited together at a railway station, but for what purpose he could not tell. He sighed, and wondered when Emily would marry him, and so fell asleep again, weaker than ever. Not having any confidence in the doctor at Belford, Mrs. Delvin had sent an urgent message to a physician at Edinburgh, famous for his skill in treating disease of the nervous system. "I cannot expect him to reach this remote place without some delay," she said. "I must bear my suspense as well as I can." "You shall not bear it alone," Emily answered. "I will wait with you till the doctor comes." Mrs. Delvin lifted her frail, wasted hands to Emily's face, drew it a little nearer, and kissed her. End of chapter 63. Chapter 64 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 64. On the way to London. The parting words had been spoken. Emily and her companion were on their way to London. For some little time they travelled in silence, alone in the railway carriage. After submitting as long as she could to lay an embargo on the use of her tongue, Mrs. Ellmother started the conversation by means of a question. "Do you think Mr. Mirabel will get over it, miss?" "It's useless to ask me," Emily said. "Even the great doctor from Edinburgh is not able to decide yet whether he will recover or not." "You have taken me into your confidence, Miss Emily, as you promised, and I have got something in my mind in consequence. May I mention it without giving offence?" "What is it?" "I wish you had never taken up with Mr. Mirabel." Emily was silent. Mrs. Ellmother, having a design of her own to accomplish, ventured to speak more plainly. "I often think of Mr. Alban Morris," she proceeded. "I always did like him, and I always shall." Emily suddenly pulled down her veil. "Don't speak of him," she said. "I didn't mean to offend you." "You don't offend me. You distress me. Oh, how often I have wished—" She threw herself back into a corner of the carriage, and said no more. Although not remarkable for the possession of delicate tact, Mrs. Ellmother decided that the best course she could now follow was a course of silence. Even at the time when she had most implicitly trusted Mirabel, the fear that she might have acted hastily and harshly toward Alban had occasionally troubled Emily's mind. The impression produced by later events had not only intensified this feeling, but had presented the motives of that true friend under an entirely new point of view. If she had been left in ignorance of the manner of her father's death, as Alban had designed to leave her, as she would have been left but for the treachery of Francine, how happily free she would have been from thoughts which it was now a terror to her to recall. She would have parted from Mirabel when the visit to the pleasant country house had come to an end, remembering him as an amusing acquaintance and nothing more. He would have been spared, and she would have been spared, the shock that had so cruelly assailed them both. What had she gained by Mrs. Rook's detestable confession? The result had been perpetual disturbance of mind, provoked by self-torturing speculations on the subject of the murder. If Mirabel was innocent, who was guilty? The false wife, without pity and without shame, or the brutal husband, who looked capable of any enormity? What was her future to be? How was it all to end? In the despair of that bitter moment, seeing her devoted old servant looking at her with kind, compassionate eyes, Emily's troubled spirit sought refuge in impetuous self-betrayal, the very betrayal which she had resolved should not escape her hardly a minute since. She bent forward out of her corner, and suddenly drew up her veil. "Do you expect to see Mr. Alban Morris when we get back?" she asked. "I should like to see him, miss, if you have no objection." "Tell him I am ashamed of myself, and say I ask his pardon with all my heart." "The Lord be praised!" Mrs. Ellmother burst out. Then, when it was too late, remembered the conventional restraints appropriate to the occasion. "Gracious, what a fool I am!" she said to herself. "Beautiful weather, Miss Emily, isn't it?" she continued, in a desperate hurry to change the subject. Emily reclined again in her corner of the carriage. She smiled for the first time since she had become Mrs. Delvin's guest at the Tower. End of Chapter 64. Chapter 65 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 65. Cecilia in a New Character. Reaching the cottage at night, Emily found the card of a visitor who had called during the day. It bore the name of Miss Wyvil, and had a message written on it which strongly excited Emily's curiosity. "I have seen the telegram which tells your servant that you return to-night. Expect me early to-morrow morning with news that will deeply interest you." To what news did Cecilia allude? Emily questioned the woman who had been left in charge of the cottage, and found that she had next to nothing to tell. Miss Wyvil had flushed up, and had looked excited when she read the telegraphic message, that was all. Emily's impatience was, as usual, not to be concealed. Expert Mrs. Ellmother treated the case in the right way, first with supper, and then with an adjournment to bed. The clock struck 12 when she put out the young mistress's candle. 10 hours to pass before Cecilia comes here!" Emily exclaimed. "Not 10 minutes," Mrs. Ellmother reminded her, "if you will only go to sleep." Cecilia arrived before the breakfast table was cleared, as lovely, as gentle, as affectionate as ever, but looking unusually serious and subdued. "Out with it at once!" Emily cried. "What have you got to tell me?" "Perhaps I had better tell you first," Cecilia said, "that I know what you kept from me when I came here, when you left us at Monksmoor. Don't think, my dear, that I say this by way of complaint. Mr. Alban Morris says you had good reasons for keeping your secret." "Mr. Alban Morris? Did you get your information from him?" "Yes. Do I surprise you?" "More than words can tell." "Can you bear another surprise? Mr. Alban Morris has seen Miss Jethro, and has discovered that Mr. Mirabel has been wrongly suspected of a dreadful crime. Our amiable little clergyman is guilty of being a coward, and guilty of nothing else. Are you really quiet enough to read about it?" She produced some leaves of paper filled with writing. "There," she explained, "is Mr. Morris's own account of all that passed between Miss Jethro and himself." "But how do you come by it?" "Mr. Morris gave it to me. He said, 'Show it to Emily as soon as possible, and take care to be with her while she reads it. There is a reason for this.'" Cecilia's voice faltered. On the brink of some explanation, she seemed to recoil from it. "I will tell you by and by what the reason is," she said. Emily looked nervously at the manuscript. "Why doesn't he tell me himself what he has discovered? Is he—" The leaves began to flutter in her trembling hands. "Is he angry with me?" "Oh, Emily, angry with you? Read what he has written, and you shall know why he keeps away." Emily opened the manuscript. End of chapter 65. Chapter 66 of I Say No. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 66. Alban's Narrative. The information which I have obtained from Miss Jethro has been communicated to me on the condition that I shall not disclose the place of her residence. "Let me pass out of notice," she said, "as completely as if I had passed out of life. I wish to be forgotten by some, and to be unknown by others." With this one stipulation, she left me free to write the present narrative of what passed at the interview between us. I feel that the discoveries which I have made are too important to the persons interested to be trusted to memory. 1. She receives me. Finding Miss Jethro's place of abode with far less difficulty than I had anticipated, thanks to favouring circumstances, I stated plainly the object of my visit. She declined to enter into conversation with me on the subject of the murder at Zealand. I was prepared to meet with this rebuke, and to take the necessary measures for obtaining a more satisfactory reception. "A person is suspected of having committed the murder," I said, "and there is reason to believe that you are in a position to say whether the suspicion is justified or not. Do you refuse to answer me if I put the question?" Miss Jethro asked who the person was. I mentioned the name Mr. Miles Mirabel. It is not necessary, and it would certainly be not agreeable to me to describe the effect which this reply produced on Miss Jethro. After giving her time to compose herself, I entered into certain explanations, in order to convince her at the outset of my good faith. The result justified my anticipations. I was at once admitted to her confidence. She said, "I must not hesitate to do an act of justice to an innocent man. But in such a serious matter as this, you have a right to judge for yourself whether the person who is now speaking to you is a person whom you can trust. You may believe that I tell the truth about others, if I begin, whatever it may cost me, by telling the truth about myself." 2. She speaks of herself. I shall not attempt to place on record the confession of a most unhappy woman. It was the common story of sin, bitterly repented, and of vain effort to recover the lost place in social esteem. Too well known a story, surely, to be told again. But I may with perfect propriety repeat what Miss Jethro said to me in allusion to later events in her life, which are connected with my own personal experience. She recalled to my memory a visit which she had paid to me at Netherwoods, and a letter addressed to her by Dr. Allday, which I had read at her express request. She said, "You may remember that the letter contained some severe reflections on my conduct. Among other things, the doctor mentioned that he called at the lodging I occupied during my visit to London, and found I had taken flight. Also that he had reason to believe that I entered Miss Ladd's service under false pretences. I asked if the doctor had wronged her. She answered no. In one case he is ignorant, in the other he is right. On leaving his house, I found myself followed in the street by the man who I owe the shame and misery of my past life. My horror of him is not to be described in words. The one way of escaping was offered by an empty cab that passed me. I reached the railway station safely, and went back to my home in the country. Do you blame me?" It was impossible to blame her, and I said so. She then confessed the deception which she had practised on Miss Ladd. "I have a cousin," she said, "who was a Miss Jethro like me. Before her marriage she had been employed as a governess. She pitied me. She sympathized with my longing to recover the character that I had lost. With her permission, I made use of the testimonials which she had earned as a teacher, I was betrayed, to this day I don't know by whom, and I was dismissed from Netherwoods. Now you know that I deceived Miss Ladd. You may reasonably conclude that I am likely to deceive you." I assured her with perfect sincerity that I had drawn no such conclusion. Encouraged by my reply, Miss Jethro proceeded as follows. 3. She speaks of Mirabel. 4 years ago I was living near Cowes in the Isle of Wight, in a cottage which had been taken for me by a gentleman who was the owner of a yacht. We had just returned from a short cruise, and the vessel was under order to sail for Cherbourg with the next tide. While I was walking in my garden, I was startled by the sudden appearance of a man, evidently a gentleman, who was a perfect stranger to me. He was in a pitiable state of terror, and he implored my protection. In reply to my first inquiries, he mentioned the inn at Zealand, and the dreadful death of a person unknown to him, whom I recognized, partly by the description given, and partly by comparison of dates, as Mr. James Brown. I shall say nothing of the shock inflicted on me. You don't want to know what I felt. What I did, having latterly only a minute left for decision, was to hide the fugitive from discovery, and to exert my influence in his favour with the owner of the yacht. I saw nothing more of him. He was put on board as soon as the police were out of sight, and was safely landed at Cherbourg. I asked what induced her to run the risk of protecting a stranger who was under suspicion of having committed a murder. She said, "You shall hear my explanation directly. Let us have done with Mr. Mirabel first. We occasionally corresponded during the long absence on the Continent, never alluding, at his express request, to the horrible event at the inn. His last letter reached me after he had established himself at Vale Regis. Writing of the society in the neighbourhood, he informed me of his introduction to Miss Wyvil, and of the invitation that he had received to meet her friend and schoolfellow at Monksmoor. I knew that Miss Emily possessed a handbill describing personal particularities in Mr. Mirabel, not hidden under the changed appearance of his head and face. If she remembered or happened to refer to that description while she was living in the same house with him, there was a possibility, at least, of her suspicion being excited. The fear of this took me to you. It was a morbid fear, and, as events turned out, an unfounded fear. But I was unable to control it. Failing to produce any effect on you, I went to Vale Regis, and tried, vainly again, to induce Mr. Mirabel to send an excuse to Monksmoor. He, like you, wanted to know what my motive was. When I tell you that I acted solely in Miss Emily's interests, and that I knew how she had been deceived about her father's death, need I say why I was afraid to acknowledge my motive? I understood that Miss Jethro might well have been afraid of the consequences if she risked any allusion to Mr. Brown's horrible death, and if it afterwards chanced to reach his daughter's ears. But this state of feeling implied an extraordinary interest in the preservation of Emily's peace of mind. I asked Miss Jethro how that interest had been excited. She answered, "I can only satisfy you in one way. I must speak of her father now." Emily looked up from the manuscript. She felt Cecilia's arm tenderly caressing her. She heard Cecilia say, "My poor dear, there is one last trial of your courage still to come. I am afraid of what you are going to read when you turn to the next page. And yet, Emily replied gently, "it must be done. I have learned my hard lesson of endurance, Cecilia. Don't be afraid." Emily turned to the next page. 4. She speaks of the dead. For the first time, Miss Jethro appeared to be at a loss how to proceed. I could see that she was suffering. She rose, and opening a drawer in her writing-table, took a letter from it. She said, "Will you read this? It was written by Miss Emily's father. Perhaps it may say more for me than I can say for myself." I copied the letter. It was thus expressed: "You have declared that our farewell today is our farewell forever. For the second time you have refused to be my wife, and you have done this, to use your own words, in mercy to me. In mercy to me, I implore you to reconsider your decision. If you condemn me to live without you, I feel it, I know it, you condemn me to despair which I have not fortitude enough to endure. Look at the passages which I have marked for you in the New Testament. Again and again, I say it. Your true repentance has made you worthy of the pardon of God. Are you not worthy of the love, admiration, and respect of man? Think, oh, Sarah, think of what our lives might be, and let them be united for time and for eternity." I can write no more. A deadly faintness oppresses me. My mind is in a state unknown to me in past years. I am in such confusion that I sometimes think I hate you, and then I recover from my delusion, and know that man never loved woman as I love you. You will have time to write to me by this evening's post. I shall stop at Zealand tomorrow on my way back, and ask for a letter at the post office. I forbid explanations and excuses. I forbid heartless allusions to your duty. Let me have an answer which does not keep me for a moment in suspense. For the last time, I ask you, do you consent to be my wife? Say yes, or say no." I gave her back the letter, with the one comment on it which the circumstances permitted me to make. "You said no." She bent her head in silence. I went on, not willingly, for I would have spared her if it had been possible. I said, "He died despairing by his own hand, and you knew it." She looked up. "No, to say that I knew it is too much. To say that I feared it is the truth. Did you love him?" She eyed me in stern surprise. "Have I any right to love? Could I disgrace an honourable man by allowing him to marry me? You look as if you held me responsible for his death." "Innocently responsible," I said. She still followed her own train of thought. "Do you suppose I could for a moment anticipate that he would destroy himself when I wrote my reply? He was a truly religious man. If he had been in his right mind, he would have shrunk from the idea of suicide as from the idea of a crime." On reflection, I was inclined to agree with her. In his terrible position, it was at least possible that the sight of the razor, placed ready with the other appliances of the toilet for his fellow-traveller's use, might have fatally tempted a man whose last hope was crushed, whose mind was tortured by despair. I should have been merciless indeed if I had held Miss Jethro accountable thus far. But I found it hard to sympathize with the course which she had pursued, in permitting Mr. Brown's death to be attributed to murder without a word of protest. "Why were you silent?" I said. She smiled bitterly. "A woman would have known why, without asking," she replied. "A woman would have understood that I shrank from a public confession of my shameful past life. A woman would have remembered the reasons I had for pitying the man who loved me, and for accepting any responsibility rather than associating his memory before the world with an unworthy passion for a degraded creature, ending in an act of suicide. Even if I had made that cruel sacrifice, Would public opinion have believed such a person as I am, against the evidence of a medical man and the verdict of a jury? No, Mr. Morris. I said nothing, and I was resolved to say nothing, so long as the choice of alternatives was left to me. On the day when Mr. Mirabel implored me to save him, that choice was no longer mine, and you know what I did. And now again, when suspicion, after all the long interval that had passed, has followed and found that innocent man, you know what I have done. What more do you ask of me? Your pardon, I said, for not having understood you, and a last favour. May I relate what I have heard to the one person of all others who ought to know, and who must know what you have told me? It was needless to hint more plainly that I was speaking of Emily. Miss Jethro granted my request. "It shall be as you please," she answered. "Say for me to his daughter that the grateful remembrance of her is my one refuge from the thoughts that tortured me when we spoke together on her last night at school. She has made this dead heart of mine feel a reviving breath of life when I think of her. Never in our earthly pilgrimage shall we meet again. I implore her to pity and forget me. Farewell, Mr. Morris. Farewell forever." I confess that the tears came into my eyes. When I could see clearly again, I was alone in the room. End of chapter 66. Chapter 67 of I Say No. This recording is in the public domain. I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 67. The True Consolation. Emily closed the pages which told her that her father had died by his own hand. Cecilia still held her tenderly embraced. By slow degrees her head dropped until it rested on her friend's bosom. Silently she suffered. Silently Cecilia bent forward and kissed her forehead. The sounds that penetrated to the room were not out of harmony with the time. From a distant house the voices of children were just audible, singing the plaintive melody of a hymn, and now and then the breeze blew the first faded leaves of autumn against the window. Neither of the girls knew how long the minutes followed each other uneventfully before there was a change. Emily raised her head and looked at Cecilia. "I have one friend left," she said. "Not only me, love. Oh, I hope not only me. Yes, only you. I want to say something, Emily, but I am afraid of hurting you. My dear, do you remember what we once read in a book of history at school? It told of the death of a tortured man in the old time who was broken on the wheel. He lived through it long enough to say that the agony after the first stroke of the club dulled his capacity for feeling pain when the next blows fell. I fancy pain of the mind must follow the same rule. Nothing you can say will hurt me now. I only wanted to ask, Emily, if you were engaged at one time to marry Mr. Mirabel. Is it true?" "False! He pressed me to consent to an engagement, and I said he must not hurry me." "What made you say that?" "I thought of Alban Morris." Vainly Cecilia tried to restrain herself. A cry of joy escaped her. "Are you glad?" Emily asked. "Why?" Cecilia made no direct reply. "May I tell you what you wanted to know a little while since?" she said. "You asked why Mr. Morris left it all to me, instead of speaking to you himself. When I put the same question to him, he told me to read what he had written. Not a shadow of suspicion rests on Mr. Mirabel. he said. "Emily is free to marry him, and free through me. Can I tell her that, for her sake and for mine, it must not be? All that I can do is to leave old remembrances to plead for me. If they fail, I shall know that she will be happier with Mr. Mirabel than with me." "And you will submit?" I asked. "Because I love her," he answered, "I must submit." "Oh, how pale you are! Have I distressed you?" "You have done me good." "Will you see him?" Emily pointed to the manuscript. "At such a time as this?" she said. Cecilia still held to her resolution. "Such a time is the right time," she answered. "It is now, when you most want to be comforted, that you ought to see him. Who can quiet your poor aching heart as he can quiet it?" She impetuously snatched at the manuscript and threw it out of sight. "I can't bear to look at it," she said. "Emily, if I have done wrong, will you forgive me? I saw him this morning before I came here. I was afraid of what might happen. I refused to break the dreadful news to you unless he was somewhere near us. Your good old servant knows where to go. Let me send her." Mrs. Ellmother herself opened the door, and stood doubtful on the threshold, hysterically sobbing and laughing at the same time. "I'm everything that's bad," the good old creature burst out. "I've been listening. I've been lying. I said you wanted him. Turn me out of my situation, if you like. I've got him. Here he is." In another moment, Emily was in his arms, and they were alone. On his faithful breast the blessed relief of tears came to her at last. She burst out crying. "Oh, Alban, can you forgive me?" He gently raised her head so that he could see her face. "My love, let me look at you," he said. "I want to think again of the day when we parted in the garden at school. Do you remember the one conviction that sustained me? I told you, Emily, there was a time of fulfillment to come in our two lives. And I have never wholly lost the dear belief. My own darling, the time has come." Postscript. Gossip in the studio. The winter-time had arrived. Alban was clearing his palette after a hard day's work at the cottage. The servant announced that tea was ready, and that Miss Ladd was waiting to see him in the next room. Alban ran in and received the visitor cordially with both hands. "Welcome back to England! I needn't ask if the sea voyage has done you any good. You are looking 10 years younger than when you went away." Miss Ladd smiled. "I shall soon become 10 years older again, if I go back to Netherwoods," she replied. "I didn't believe it at the time, but I know better now. Our friend Dr. Alday was right when he said that my working days were over. I must give up the school to a younger and stronger successor, and make the best I can in retirement for what is left of my life. You and Emily may expect to have me as a near neighbour. Where is Emily?" "Far away in the north." "In the north? You don't mean that she has gone back to Mrs. Delvin?" "She has gone back, with Mrs. Ellmother to take care of her, at my express request. You know what Emily is when there is an act of mercy to be done. The unhappy man has been sinking, with intervals of partial recovery, for months past. Mrs. Delvin sent word to us that the end was near, and that the one last wish her brother was able to express was the wish to see Emily. He had been for some hours unable to speak when my wife arrived, but he knew her, and smiled faintly. He was just able to lift his hand. She took it, and waited by him, and spoke words of consolation and kindness from time to time. As the night advanced, he sank into sleep, still holding her hand. They only knew that he had passed from sleep to death, passed without a movement or a sigh, when his hand turned cold. Emily remained for a day at the Tower to comfort poor Mrs. Delvin, and she comes home, thank God, this evening. "I needn't ask if you are happy," Miss Ladd said. "Happy! I sing when I have my bath in the morning. If that isn't happiness in a man of my age, I don't know what is. And how are you getting on?" "Famously. I have turned portrait painter since you were sent away for your health. A portrait of Mr. Wyvil is to decorate the town hall in the place that he represents, and our dear kind-hearted Cecilia has induced a fascinated mayor and corporation to confide the work to my hands." "Is there no hope of that sweet girl being married?" Miss Ladd asked. "We old maids all believe in marriage, Mr. Morris, though some of us don't own it." "There seems to be a chance," Alban answered. "A young lord has turned up at Monksmoor, a handsome, pleasant fellow, and a rising man in politics. He happened to be in the house a few days before Cecilia's birthday, and he asked my advice about the right present to give her. I said, try something new in tarts. When he found I was in earnest, what do you think he did? Sent his steam yacht to Rouen for some of the famous pastry. You should have seen Cecilia when the young lord offered his delicious gift. If I could paint that smile and those eyes, I should be the greatest artist living. I believe she will marry him. Need I say how rich they will be? We shall not envy them. We are rich too. Everything is comparative. The portrait of Mr. Wyvil will put £300 in my pocket. I have earned 120 more by illustrations since we have been married, and my wife's income, I like to be particular, is only 5 shillings and 10 pence short of 200 a year. Moral, we are rich as well as happy." "Without a thought of the future?" Miss Ladd asked slyly. "Oh, Dr. Allday has taken the future in hand. He revels in the old-fashioned jokes which used to be addressed to married people in his time. My dear fellow," he said the other day, "you may possibly be under the joyful necessity of sending for the doctor before we are all a year older. In that case, let it be understood that I am honorary physician to the family." The warm-hearted old man talks of getting me another portrait to do. "The greatest ass in the medical profession," he informed me, "has just been made a baronet, and his admiring friends have decided that he is to be painted at full length, with his bandy legs hidden under a gown, and his great globular eyes staring at the spectator. I'll get you the job." Shall I tell you what he says of Mrs. Rook's recovery? Miss Ladd held up her hands in amazement. "Recovery!" she exclaimed. "And a most remarkable recovery, too," Alban informed her. "It is the first case on record of any person getting over such an injury as she has received. Dr. Allday looked grim when he heard of it. "I begin to believe in the devil," he said. "Nobody else could have saved Mrs. Rook." Other people don't take that view. She has been celebrated in all the medical newspapers, and she has been admitted to an excellent almshouse, to live in comfortable idleness to a green old age. The best of it is that she shakes her head when her wonderful recovery is mentioned. 'It seems such a pity,' she says. 'I was so fit for heaven.' Mr. Rook, having got rid of his wife, is in excellent spirits. He is occupied in looking after an imbecile old gentleman, and when he is asked if he likes the employment, he winks mysteriously and slaps his pocket. Now, Miss Ladd, I think it's my turn to hear some news. What have you got to tell me?" "I believe I can match your account of Mrs. Rook," Miss Ladd said. "Do you care to hear what has become of Francine?" Alban, rattling on hitherto in boyish high spirits, suddenly became serious. "I have no doubt Miss de Sor is doing well," he said sternly. "She is too heartless and wicked not to prosper." "You are getting like your old cynical self again, Mr. Morris, and you are wrong. I called this morning on the agent who had the care of Francine when I left England. When I mentioned her name, he showed me a telegram sent to him by her father. 'There's my authority,' he said, 'for letting her leave my house.' The message was short enough to be easily remembered. 'Anything my daughter likes, as long as she doesn't come back to us.' In those cruel terms Mr. de Sor wrote of his own child. The agent was just as unfeeling in his way. He called her the victim of slighted love and clever proselytizing. In plain words, he said, the priest of the Catholic chapel close by has converted her, and she is now a novice in a convent of Carmelite nuns in the west of England. Who could have expected it? Who knows how it may end?" As Miss Ladd spoke, the bell rang at the cottage gate. "Here she is!" Alban cried, leading the way into the hall. "Emily has come home!" End of I Say No by Wilkie Collins. Recording by Sandra.